Philosophical Questions About Religion, Waller's Consider Philosophy, Chapter 2. Remembering the dictum, never discuss politics or religion, many instructors are frightened by the notion of introducing religion into an academic course. This fact is a terrible shame, however, since religion is one of the topics which is guaranteed to elicit a response from students. As Paul Tillich stated, God, or religion, is man's ultimate concern. To fail to possess an interest in religion is to fail to possess an interest in life. Therefore, the instructor should gladly introduce religion into the class. It may, of course, be a good idea to first establish some basic ground rules, such as keeping an open mind or even suspending one's beliefs for the duration of the discussion. However, this could be said of philosophy in general, not just about religion. In a philosophy class, one must apply critical thinking to the question of religion, rather than mere dogma. When raising the central question concerning God's existence, one must first determine what is meant by God. There are numerous gods and numerous conceptions of God. To construct an argument supporting the existence of Lord Krishna does not necessarily prove the existence of Yahweh. Much of the confusion found in religious arguments stems from this lack of clarity. Each individual will possess their own conception of God and assume that everyone else will understand God in the same manner. For this reason, all arguments concerning the existence of God may be challenged. Despite the apparent appeal to ignorance of such claims, this chapter introduces 5 major arguments in support of the existence of God, and 2 major arguments which try to deny the existence. The well-known arguments supporting the existence of God will be looked at one by one. However, I do this very quickly here. You can certainly go into more depth. There's plenty of information out there, not only in the book, but also online. The cosmological argument comes from Thomas Aquinas. And it says, since the existence of God is not a self-evident proposition, one must seek the incorporeal through the corporeal. In other words, God is not a being that we can know by looking at its core essence. We don't have direct contact with God, so we have to derive the existence of God from the world around us. The ontological argument comes to us from St. Anselm. If we assume that our definition of God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, we can know the existence of God as being self-evident. So in essence, his argument is contrary to the one that Aquinas makes. If we imagine that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, there's nothing higher, nothing greater, nothing beyond God, then we have to envision existence as one of the many attributes of God. Otherwise, we'd be able to think of something greater, namely, an entity that has all of these things but also exists. So to define God is to know that God is real. The teleological argument comes to us largely through the work of William Paley. We only need to look at nature to discover that there is a design within nature. And of course, a design requires an architect. You can see here a watch, which was William Paley's famous example, as well as a strand of DNA to link it to our modern view of things. If we look at the world and its workings, we find that everything functions in a particular fashion, in a particular way. How could that have happened simply by chance? It has to have had some kind of designer. The intuitive argument comes to us through W.T. Stace, and he says the only way to know God is internally. Seek truth with the heart rather than with the mind. And so rather than trying to create some lavish explanation, some logical argument, as these others were doing to try to prove the existence of God, Stace says it's something you simply know, you feel it inside of yourself. And finally, Pascal's wager, given to us by Blaise Pascal. He says, if one plays the odds, then the only way to win is to bet on the existence of God, since any other bet would yield punishment or non-existence. Think of it from the standpoint of a wager. I can bet that God exists, or I can bet that God doesn't exist. If I bet that God exists, and I'm right, then I've won everything. But if I bet that God is wrong, or doesn't exist, and it turns out that I'm right, well, I haven't won anything. And if it turns out that I'm wrong, I've lost everything. So the only logical thing to do would be to bet on and act as if God exists. Now, of course, I think we'd have to wonder what God might think of somebody whose faith was based upon a wager. But nonetheless, that's Pascal's view. The attempts to disprove the existence of God frequently depend upon either the problem of evil or the desire for simplicity. The problem of evil has been relayed in many forms, but it's most easily understood in the form of the following trilemma. God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, evil exists. These three statements are claims that are made by individuals that, God is this all-powerful being, this individual who has every ability, this person who could stop evil if he chose to. God is all-loving, which means he would hopefully have the desire to prevent evil. But yet, when we look at this world, it's hard to deny that evil exists. And there you see an image of the biblical Job, who suffers all of this terrible evil. Now, there's no difficulty in accepting any two of these statements, but it appears logically impossible to try to accept all three, since an all-powerful God would be able to stop evil, and an all-loving God would want to prevent evil. So how could evil exist in the world? Well, believers have tried to counter this argument by attempting to explain that God allows evil so that good might be appreciated, or that evil is to be overcome as a soul-building experience. That's what the story of Job is supposed to teach. However, 20th century atrocities such as the Shoah have caused a lot of people to reject these responses. As Emil Fackenheim pointed out in his book God's Presence in History, the actions of the Nazi machine and the creation of the Musulmaner was a soul-destroying experience, which led to the loss of faith rather than strengthening it. When you have so much physical, emotional, stressful suffering, and a suffering that keeps going, it seems that what it does is to break that person down, to destroy that individual, rather than allowing them the freedom to be able to overcome it. Right? Job, in enduring those terrible sufferings, will come back and be rewarded many times over for them. However, the people in the concentration camps didn't have that opportunity. There was no overcoming, there was no improvement, but rather it was simply destruction. Another attempt to disprove the existence of God is derived from the principle of economy, or what's known as Ockham's razor. And this instructs that one should always choose the simplest solution, all things being equal. Right? Entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. Don't complicate things. Don't make things more difficult than they have to be. So, scientifically, for example, we should choose the heliocentric view of the universe over the geocentric view. Both theories would allow individuals to understand the universe, but the geocentric version required more calculations. It required the inclusion of ellipses, and these things weren't necessary to the heliocentric view. Likewise, it's argued if science can explain the universe without God, then there's no need to include this superfluous element in one's theory. Okay, why, all things being equal, why complicate things? Make them as simple as they possibly can be. If we can understand the universe without God, then why should we have to include God? In fact, science and Western religion are frequently at odds, particularly with regards to the theory of evolution. If God created the world in 4004 BC, as Bishop Ussher calculated based upon the recorded data of Genesis, then how could the world be millions of years old, as Darwin claimed? If God created all things fully formed, then where is the proof of evolution? One solution to this dilemma is taken by many church leaders, including Pope John Paul II and Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it's to claim that science and religion occupy different spheres. One should not read the Bible to discover scientific truths any more than one should read Darwin for spiritual truth. However, this separation is not necessarily required. If one turns to Eastern religion, then the earth is already recognized as billions of years old. In fact, the Bhagavad Gita solved this problem before it arose in stanzas 17 and 18 of the 8th teaching. Even in Western religions, thinkers have found ways to reconcile the two. Kenneth Miller's text, Finding Darwin's God, is an excellent starting place for such arguments. Of course, of all the difficulties of religious texts, they trace back to that initial problem of defining what is meant by God. So perhaps the best approach to this problem is to follow Tillich, who claimed that all human conceptions of God are mere concepts, and that one must seek to discover the God behind God. The word God is a generic label, which is used to allow one to focus on the divine. However, since the conception is derived by humans, it is potentially far removed from the truth of God. If one adopts Tillich's view, one quickly realizes the folly of attempting arguments directly concerning God. Usually, one will find that any argument which attempts to either prove or disprove the existence of God falls victim to the appeal to ignorance fallacy, since human language is inadequate to discuss the divine. Perhaps this is, at least in part, what Wittgenstein meant when he wrote, "Of what we cannot speak, we must pass over in silence."